Andy Austin here with another chapter review from The Rainbow Machine, Tales from a Neurolinguist's Journal by Andrew T. Austin. This is my favourite chapter. This is the Satan chapter, where I dress up as the devil himself in order to confront a psychiatrist who wanted to deal with some religious-based issues. And I figured the best way to do that would be to be Satan. This is something I would recommend more coaches and therapists do, or even though I do it a lot less now, and that is to add the theatrics and drama into the sessions that you do with people. One of the problems about therapy is it's incredibly boring to watch. Now, whether it's boring for the participants, I'm not so sure, but a lot of therapy is immediately forgettable. It's just two people in an office talking to each other in a very professional, grown-up manner for hours on end, weeks at a time, months, years even. And what I get happening, what I'm seeing happening, is a ritual of therapy being performed by two parties. The coaches, therapists, psychiatrists, etc., they know the script. They know the ritual that they have to perform. They have a uniform they have to wear. If they're the hippie type, they wear the hippie clothes. If they're a psychiatrist, they're going to wear more business type clothes, and everything in between. They will have a certain type of office, which will have a certain type of decor. There's usually a little bookshelf with a few things in there and a potted plant. You can pretty much script it. They know the script. And then the client arrives, who also knows the script. They know how they're supposed to behave as a client. And they both perform the ritual of therapy perfectly. The therapist says the words to word perfect, the client says their words word perfectly, and each week or each month, however often they come together, they meet and they perform this perfect, culturally defined ritual of therapy. Now, I began to question that cultural ritual. Is it fulfilling the requirements of what society and culture thinks of as therapy, or is it actually doing something useful? And my observation is that it's most of the time not doing anything useful whatsoever. If it was useful, why does it take, say, 20 sessions? What are they doing on the 20th session that wasn't happening on the first 19? Those are the kind of questions I started to have, and it's predominantly NLP, Bandler type influence, because it's the kind of stuff he would raise. And I was relieved when I came across people like Richard Bandler and Frank Farrelly as well, and a few other luminaries in the field. They would bring the theatre into the work that they do. They would bring emotional impact into what's happening. There was none of this, let's just sit around and talk about it. This was an experience. To be on the receiving end of those guys is an experience, and it's not one people are likely to forget. And that, to me, is going to make much more of an impression upon someone's psyche than simply sitting around talking about it. Now, one of my other backgrounds is in ceremonial magic, in initiatory orders, fraternal orders, that kind of stuff. So I've got quite a lengthy background in doing weird stuff in weird temples. And initiations are something I've always quite liked in terms of how they're structured. Now, for those who've never been involved in anything like that, it's not the initiations that you associate with high school and colleges and the hazing and nonsense like that. Not talking about those kind of things. Initiations are processes, they're a psychodrama, they're a theatrical performance in which the candidate arrives in an environment. It might be a temple, it's a hired hall somewhere a lot of the time. Sometimes it's somebody's living room. And there's a whole cast of actors on the other side. Now, it is scripted, they do have a script, and hopefully have learned the script, but that doesn't always happen. And the candidate arrives, and they don't really know what it is they're arriving for. And they're about to enter into this drama, and they both have to work out the part that they play, and they're a participant within it, but they don't know what the script is. And so essentially this is using the system known as shocks. Along the way, the candidate is presented with choice points, where they have to speak and have to answer a question, and they're not entirely sure which way they're supposed to answer it. So they find something out about themselves. What actually pops out of their mouth as opposed to what they thought they were going to say. And this is the shock system. It's not shocks as in, whoa, get spooked. There's nothing horrible that happens to people, but it can be a little bit stressful. These are psychodramas that actually make an impression upon the psyche of the candidate. And there's lots of dressing up, there's normally lots of different sounds involved, it's a sensory-rich environment, there's lots of There's lots of incense is used, different lighting is used, sometimes darkness is used to effect, and so forth, in order to really create a sensory impression upon the mind of the candidate, to basically impart a specific set of understandings. Now we compare that to therapy, where we're trying to make an impression upon the psyche of the patient to make them better, and we just sit there professionally talking about it. And how does that make you feel? And how does that make you feel? Is there anything else you'd like to say? Oh dear God, the stuff that goes... We've got to do more than that. So in this Satan chapter, I dressed up. I lived yards. In the book it says I'm about a mile away. That's actually not true. It was probably about 100 yards away. There was a fancy dress hire shop, which made getting costuming quite simple for me. I didn't do it that often, but I did do it. And periodically it would be quite interesting to get dressed up for the effects I was doing. Colossally unprofessional. This is not what people expect when they're brilliant. That's what I'm after. That's not very professional, Mr. Austin. I know, thank you. Because I don't want to be professional. Because the moment I'm professional, so's the client. And we have this professional exchange, which may or may not result in change work for that individual. One of the other things that I did, I had a family that I worked with. It was predominantly the parents, but on the first appointment, they did bring their kids with them. But it was clearly there's nothing to do with the kids. The kids were fine. They were just reacting to the mum and dad. But mum and dad were, let's just say, rather antagonistic towards one another. You could feel the atmosphere the moment they all piled into my little basement flat. I lived literally in a basement flat under the ground. There was a window, I didn't get much natural daylight, and the window looked out onto the pavement, and all you'd see is ankles and feet walking past. I was in the centre of the city. And so that's where they came into, and I could just feel this, oh, this is uncomfortable, oh, this isn't so good. I'm not going to be able to help these two people. It's like I'm sat there, not with my mum and dad, but it's like I'm sat there with mum and dad, because I was only in my early 20s, and these are parents behaving like mum and dad. And there's clearly an issue going on, and father has the control. You can see he's the control agent here, and mother reacts to that control, which triggers him to be more controlling, and I could just see it going round and round and round. Right, I say, we're going to go and get dressed up. And we go up the road, just a very short distance, and I go and get clown costumes, and we do a session dressed as clowns. And that kind of changes the dynamic a little bit. It also means it's a cost. That was the other issue here. Because I've got a fixed fee, which wasn't very much for these people, and I'm going to go and get the costumes. Great. So not the great business plan that I had here, but it was a lot of fun to do. And so now what we've got are mum and dad dressed as clowns. And I was quite surprised they went for it. But it changes the dynamic quite dramatically. Because when father has got the hair that flaps around and he starts doing his thing, and the hair's flapping around, he's got a stupid nose which he takes off and hurls across the room, it kind of changes the impression that everyone now has of father's control. When mother's doing her thing as well, dressed as a clown, again, it does change what... Now let's scroll forward a week. How do they remember that argument that they had, well, with me, admittedly, in that session? How do they remember that argument as clowns? And that's what I wanted to put in their heads. This is not about, let's ameliorate the symptoms, let's make everything better, let's make everyone feel nice, let's have everyone loving themselves. That's a noble thing to try, and it works well in the books. I'm not so sure how well it works when you have family dynamics and they're well set, very hard to get into. Now they've got memories of each other being clowns and themselves being clowns. That kind of gives me a little bit of leverage now, that when we talk to them later on, I can call back on that. They have a different set of impressions now in their head. They're carrying a different set of pictures of themselves and of other people. Now we've got leverage to start work with people. A lot of coaches and therapists don't think like this, which is maybe not be a bad thing, I don't know. But they don't. It's more like, okay, I, as the coach, am going to understand the situation, and then I will offer words of wisdom and some guidance. We might need to do more than that. We might actually need to create some shocks where we insert experiences into their psyche that allow the person to start to think differently. One of the things that Milton Erickson did with a particular client, I don't know how common he did this with people who wanted to lose weight, he got that person to increase their weight initially to begin with. Now, as you can imagine, someone who's gone to the therapist, go, I need you to hypnotize me to help me lose weight, and they discover they've been hypnotized to increase weight, is going to have a reaction to that. Now, that's put something in their head that has leveraged the system. It also has changed things, because having increased that weight to a certain degree, we can then get them to normalize back to what it was before, which was their baseline. Guess what? They've just lost some weight. And so by disrupting the system, by putting something in that is change, but not necessarily what the person expected, it can then give us leverage to help them get the change in the direction they want it to have happen. This is where we have to be a lot more strategic. And I believe it was Jay Haley that wrote the book Strategic Psychotherapy, and I'm going to highly recommend all the NLPers out there read that book, because having a strategy rather than having reflexive, responsive set of questions according to how the client behaves is a much better way of helping people change, putting a structure into the session. Now, I don't do the dressing up thing so often these days, predominantly because I don't have the resources apart from what I have in the attic. I live in a different place now. I don't have fancy dress hair shops on the doorstep. If I did, I probably would do this a little more. I have now, because I have greater experience in life and greater behavioral flexibility, then I'm much more likely to do stuff with the attitudes that I display with clients, the things that I say, the ways that I work. But I will still recommend people do the dressing up if you can. Get creative about it. The chances are you will be deemed to be unprofessional. If you are being professional, the question I would have is, how effective are you? Because professionalism seems to be a set of professional handcuffs that go on to people, and now you have to obey a set of rules and principles and cultural expectations of being a therapist. And if you don't do that, then you're deemed to be unprofessional. When I worked in hospitals, I saw a lot of very bad things happen to people, perpetrated by professionals. And you know what? All of my colleagues, it would happen in front of them, and no one saw anything bad happen because everyone was just being professional. Anyone who has been subjected to, say, some of the abuses of psychiatry, that was probably done very professionally, and yet the damage is done to the patient. So professionalism doesn't necessarily protect the patient. And it can perpetrate abuse on people without them even being aware of it, without the therapists being aware of it, or the doctors or nurses or whoever. So professionalism isn't really, for me, a particularly good measure of how good a therapist is. It's a good way of hiding. And it's a good way of hiding my own inadequacies, and hiding my own problems, and hiding my own issues, because I'm a professional. And so that's just something I want to point out to people. Just be aware of those things. And please, get creative if you are a therapist. Start working out better strategies of getting impressions upon the psyche of your patient in order to help them change and get the results that they're looking for.